Welcome back. If you saw part 1, you know that Dr. Joan Ifland tried to silence me with a cease and desist. I will link that video in the description. This is part 2, where I address the second cease and desist from Sheila Gravely, one of the directors in the Addiction Reset community. I'll break down her statements, what's accurate, what's misleading, and why this matters for anyone considering or already involved in the Addiction Reset community. Let's get to it. First, I'm going to show you the cease and desist I received from Sheila. You can pause it and read it. Let's get into it. In her email, Sheila referenced Virginia Code 541-3501, which exempts clergy from licensure when counseling under the authority of an established church. I fully recognize that pastoral counseling is valid and protected form of support when it operates within that narrow framework. However, her current work in the Addiction Reset community, or the ARC, is not under the authority of a church, and thus this exemption no longer applies. If you've been in the ARC or are currently a member of the ARC, then you know that the ARC isn't a church. The ARC felt more cult-like or a high control group to me, but not a church. Even saying the word church is prohibited in the ARC. It's against the rules. Sheila also referred to herself as a retired therapist, but being exempt from licensure as a pastor is not the same as holding a formal license as in counseling or therapy. That distinction matters when it comes to perception of professional authority in trauma-related work. The concern isn't whether she once had pastoral credentials, but whether the current work happening in the Addiction Reset community crosses the line into something that feels clinical without being licensed or regulated. So let's break it down. Virginia law, the statute Sheila cites, provides an exemption from licensure for clergy who are counseling as part of their ministerial duties under the authority of a church. That means pastors can legally provide counseling without holding a state license, as long as it's within their role as clergy. It does not make them licensed, it simply exempts them from needing a license. So technically, Sheila never held a Virginia counseling license, at least not one that I am able to find. She was exempt from licensure because she was operating under her church's pastoral authority. When she retired from ministry in 2019, that exemption no longer applied. Even in her email to me, she phrases it in a confusing way. To be clear, I do not operate under my previous license. I do not present myself as a therapist, but as a retired therapist. But legally, she didn't have a state-issued therapy license to operate under. She had an exemption, not a license. Calling herself a retired therapist could give the impression of licensure. It suggests she once held a formal license, though Virginia records don't show that she ever did. Coaching credentials and scope of practice. Sheila describes herself as a master certified life coach and a certified natural health professional. Neither of these certifications authorizes a person to guide others through trauma, parts work, or emotional recovery in a clinical or quasi-clinical capacity. The term non-clinical support that she uses can often blur ethical lines, especially when clients come to trust peer advocates as authority figures in emotional or trauma recovery. My concern, and the concern I shared, is that many ARC members may not understand the difference between licensed therapy and peer-led parts work. In practice, the lines between emotional processing, trauma guidance, and coaching have become increasingly blurred within the ARC. That has ethical implications for both members and advocates. So let's talk about quasi-clinical practice, the unauthorized practice of a licensed profession. Most U.S. states have laws prohibiting the unlicensed practice of psychology, counseling, or therapy. Even if someone doesn't call what they're doing therapy, if their activities look like therapy, for example, trauma processing, inner child work, treating emotional conditions, a state licensing board could consider it the practice of counseling without a license. If someone is harmed during this practice, they could pursue legal action like a civil lawsuit, Without a license, there's no malpractice insurance or regulatory protection. I'll talk more about this in a minute. Blurring boundaries. Members may not understand the difference between licensed therapy and peer support. If the support feels like therapy, they might assume the person is qualified to handle trauma safely. Risk of harm. Without proper training, someone may unintentionally re-traumatize a participant or worsen their mental health. For example, opening up childhood trauma without proper skills. False sense of safety. Words like retired therapist or practices that mimic therapy may create misplaced trust, which can be damaging if the person is not qualified to handle a crisis. Consequences. If members perceive that trauma counseling is being offered by unlicensed staff, they could report it to regulatory agencies like state licensing boards or consumer protection agencies or other entities. Okay, so I said I would discuss malpractice insurance or regulatory protection, why having a license matters, or why not having a license matters. Malpractice insurance. Licensed professionals such as therapists, counselors, and social workers are eligible for professional liability insurance, often referred to as malpractice insurance. This insurance protects them if the client claims harm. This protects the therapist. For example, if someone says their counselor re-traumatized them or they were given damaging advice and files a claim, then the therapist's malpractice insurance will cover them, protect them. Without a license, you can't get malpractice insurance. That means if something goes wrong, an advocate or director in the addiction reset community could be held personally liable. Their assets, savings, and reputation are at risk. Regulatory oversight. Licensed professionals are accountable to state licensing boards. These boards set ethical guidelines, handle complaints, and can investigate misconduct. Clients and members have somewhere to turn if they are harmed. Licensing ensures a baseline of competence. Without that, people may overestimate their abilities or use methods like parts work without fully understanding the risks. Without a license, there's no oversight. If harm happens in the community, members don't have a licensing board to report to. Their only option is to leave, go public, or file a lawsuit. How this applies to ARC advocates. Employees are sometimes covered under an organization's liability insurance and sometimes malpractice coverage as well, if applicable. Independent contractors, subcontractors, are generally not covered under the company's liability or malpractice insurance. Advocates in the addiction reset community are independent contractors, not employees. That means they're personally responsible for their own liability. Since they're not licensed, unless they have a license outside of the ARC, they cannot purchase professional malpractice insurance, at least that I am aware of. I have not been able to find any that I could purchase as an advocate. Insurers only cover licensed clinicians. If a member claims harm, both the Food Addiction Reset, FAR, and the individual advocate could be sued. But FAR could try to shift blame and throw the advocate under the bus, since they're an independent contractor. Bottom line is, this leaves the advocate personally exposed if a member ever claims harm from parts work or any therapy-like support. Sheila describes my email as potentially defamatory. Defamation means knowingly making a false statement of fact. That's not what I did. I shared my perspective based on publicly available information and my direct experience as an ARC director and advocate. Sharing my own experience and professional concerns is protected speech, especially in this context about a potentially unsafe and misleading practice. Raising concerns about credentials and ethical boundaries is not defamation. And just to be clear, stating a truth that someone doesn't like is not defamation. I see her threat of legal action as an attempt to silence me. It makes me wonder why she doesn't want this talked about. And it sends the message that those who raise questions or concerns will be silenced rather than heard. In my view, this is the kind of environment that fosters harm, not healing. Sheila suggested that if I had questions about her credentials, I could have addressed them with her privately. However, I did not need to inquire about her background or her credentials privately. She shared it publicly on her website. My statement was about whether these credentials qualify her to lead trauma-related work such as parts work, which is a matter of scope of practice, not of personal character. This is also not a concern that came up out of nowhere. When I was a director, Sheila, myself, and another director discussed our shared concerns with the way parts work was being introduced in the ARC and how it risked going beyond the limits of what peer support advocates are qualified to do. At that time, we were in agreement. My choice to share my perspective more broadly came only after it became clear that the concerns brought up by myself and by other advocates were, in my opinion, not being fully addressed, and that advocates deserve to hear and analyze the information for themselves so that they can make informed decisions. I stand by my right to share my perspective. I also stand by my commitment to ethical peer support, informed consent, and a clear scope of practice boundaries that protect those in the community. Sheila states she is committed to leading with transparency, professionalism, and care. Yet she signs the email former licensed pastoral counselor under Virginia Code 54.1-3501, using the word license to describe her credentials. Yet at the beginning of the email, she states she practiced under the exemption of needing a license. So which is it? Did Sheila have a license or didn't she? This is why it's so confusing. Where's the transparency that she speaks of? Sheila has even said herself that she has the education and requirements to be a therapist. She has a master's degree in psychology. But here's the catch. Having a degree is not the same thing as being a licensed therapist. Education provides knowledge, but licensure is what allows you to legally practice and be held accountable to professional standards. Without being licensed, you cannot legally be recognized as a therapist, regardless of education. Also, in my opinion, if Sheila truly held a license, wouldn't it be listed on her website? The way retired professionals always show their credentials, it's not there. For me, that omission raises questions. This is exactly why I brought up my concerns. Because words like licensed or qualified can give a false sense of authority in areas where there's no license, no oversight, and no protection for the people receiving that support. In closing, getting a cease and desist from Sheila Gravely didn't silence me and won't silence me. It only confirmed why I spoke up in the first place. If leaders in the addiction reset community truly believed in transparency, these conversations would be welcomed, not shut down. My hope is that by sharing this, others can see the importance of asking hard questions and paying attention to red flags. At the core, this is about protecting people and about protecting the members of the addiction reset community. Everything I've shared here is based on my own personal experience and the information available to me at the time of this recording. If you want to hear more or talk privately, I'm here. Until next time, take care and trust in yourself.